And this is the Prairie Weekly on Prairie Public Radio. I'm Dave Thompson. Thanks for joining us. Our guest today is the new chairman of the North Dakota Republican Party, Kevin Kramer. And our guest questioner today, Carter Wood, political reporter for the Bismarck Tribune. Kevin, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dave. My pleasure.
I guess I'd like to start out with the basic question. Why did you want the chairman's job?
Well, I tell you, I've asked myself the question many times in recent months and certainly in recent days. But I think because 1992 presents such a great opportunity, not just for the Republican Party, but for North Dakota in general, to start making a difference and turn some things around that I think need to be turned around. And frankly, the challenge, when you've gone as far as we've gone, and I've been executive director for through the last campaign, and we made some gains, as you know, in the legislature and in statewide races, and kind of have the vehicle turned around and starting to head the right direction. You kind of want to see it, through and step up the pace a little bit. So now that I think that Chairman Freeberg has us going basically the right direction, I just want to put it in a higher gear. And so the challenge and the opportunity really are what enticed me to take on the challenge.
And you are going to remain, at least for the time being, as executive director as well.
Well, I will carry on the responsibilities of the executive director, at least for a while, and maybe throughout the campaign. That remains to be seen. We have an executive committee meeting later this week where we'll discuss that, and I will certainly adhere to the wishes of the executive committee. But I do think that we'd be losing some of what I've gained in terms of experience if we were to make a switch right now. So yeah, for now at least I'll keep the responsibilities. I doubt many people will refer to me as the executive director, but anyway.
Okay.
This is Carter Wood here, and the traditional line now, and I guess it's getting kind of old, is Kevin Kramer, the young, aggressive campaigner. Mm-hmm. And I imagine you've heard enough about that. But I guess I wanted to ask that in terms of past Republican criticism and aggressive stance, which I think has probably been absent. I think of the problems that the Sinner administration has had, for instance, with the Workers' Comp Bureau, which is run by a Sinner appointee, the debacle with Fred Hefner, the departed head of economic development, and several articles that I've written about a department in economic development, the Defense Procurement Department, that the federal government thinks is woefully mismanaged, and policies too in job service where they are engaged in something called race norming, which is adjusting racial scores upwards for people who take job employment tests. Mm-hmm. Now, all of these are, I think, legitimate targets of criticism and complaint, and certainly would seem to be logical targets for the Republicans to criticize the Sinner administration.
Right.
And yet, I rarely heard a peep. Why is that, and do you think maybe with your aggressive style, if you will, that'll change?
Well, yeah, I think it will change a little bit, although on the issues that deal with state matters are much more difficult for partisan politics because of the fact that we have, 26 senators and 58 House members, all of whom have strong opinions about these issues, not all of them, by the way, unified, as you well know. And the other thing is that, it's really their job to kind of be the checks and balances. And so we rely a lot on our legislative leadership and our legislators to kind of be the watchdogs of state government. And so it's many times the personality of the legislature is reflected. Although I think, these issues that you brought up are certainly, they're issues that deal with integrity or lack of it in many regards, certainly poor judgment, and could be easy targets for anybody. And I would hope to step that effort up a little bit. When it comes to matters of Congress, of course, they tend to be a little easier targets for all of us, just because the institution itself is so held in such low regard. I think that somewhere well below, a member of Congress is regarded well below a used car salesman in terms, by most polls. And so they become easy targets also because there's such huge ramifications nationally with what they do, and we just have such an interesting situation with our junior senator and his promises. So they become a little easier targets. But I do think that it's very necessary to step up the watchdog efforts of the Sinner administration. In fact, it was Lloyd Amdahl who wrote in a book that it is the job of the party that is not in power to be the watchdog and the critic of the party that is. And so, in fact, I have his quote hanging on my wall in my office and refer to it often. So, yeah, I think that needs to be stepped up a little bit.
Well, is it possible, and this was suggested by Senator Jim Maxon, who was the Democratic lead on workers' compensation reform, in a recent letter to other Democrats.
Right.
He suggested that the Republicans were, opposed to the merger with Job Service and the Labor Department because they wanted things to be fouled up for a while longer, so you could make a political issue of it. Are you just saving your shots until during the campaign?
Well, that's some pretty creative thinking on the part of Senator Maxon, because that's more creative than we're even able to be. So I would not give much credibility to that claim, although in fact, quite the contrary. I think it hurt his credibility tremendously. That memo was very unfortunate for them that it got out publicly. I'm sure that was not what he intended it to do, but. People think that I sit in this think tank someplace and think up all these things. I sit and scheme all day long about how I'm going to get after them next week, and that's just not the case. We pretty much take things as they occur. We do a fair amount of research, but we don't have a very large staff. So most of what comes up that we go after in terms of a hard attack is stuff that, for the most part, I have in the back of my mind. Something that I recall from a campaign, or that I recall from a legislative session, and I see a contradiction, and I'm able to put my finger right on it. And that's why some of these issues that deal with agencies become quite complex, and they're more for, I think, as I've said earlier, more for legislators to attack than for me, and we need to work toward that.
Well, are we going to see a Bryce and Pete show again? Senator Naden and Streibel out on the road?
Well, as you know, Senators Naden and Streibel don't need to be prompted by anybody to aggressively go after the opposition, and nor are they to be taken lightly. I think some people thought maybe they were a year ago, and that certainly is not the case. They proved to be very effective, and we certainly appreciated their efforts, and frankly, they turned out to be right on most occasions. And but I don't know whether they will or they won't. I haven't discussed it with either one of them, but I do think that there needs to be more of that by more of our legislators, and there may very well be. The other thing that I'm working toward and that I'd like to see is that the people who want to hold the positions are the ones that need to become the critics, because if it's much more credible for somebody who wants to be a governor, who intends on seeking the office or is seeking the office, to be the person that blows the whistle, because they're more credible. I think there's more newsworthiness in that. But at the same time, then it is their obligation to tell the public then how they would change it or what they would do differently. And I think that's crucial. It's one thing to beat up on the other guy, but it's another whole responsibility to tell what you do differently. And I think that's an important step. And I'm encouraging some of our people who might want to run for the United States Senate to start doing that as well, because again, it's one thing for me to do it, but it's much more credible if a candidate does it.
I noticed that you do focus on the Senate race a lot. In your victory address, you mentioned Kent Conrad. You not necessarily by name.
Right.
There's been a lot of talk about Conrad. There was that button that Steve Sidness was handing out, the Conrad with that red no symbol
Busters.
through it.
Yeah.
Conrad Busters.
Who are you going to call him?
I hear a lot about Conrad, but you don't hear as much about Dorgan, or the governor's race just yet. Is this a party strategy to go after Conrad because Conrad may be top of the ticket?
No, it really isn't. What it is that Kent Conrad tends to goof up more than those other guys, and it's pretty easy to pick on a guy that tends to kind of make regular mistakes, and certainly his his campaign promises have become almost a joke in Washington. They literally are a joke among his colleagues, and so he's just kind of an easy target. The other thing is that, first of all, make no mistake, our top commitment is the governor's race. I mean, it is. As a party, that is the key race. But there's an unknown there. We're not sure who the candidate's going to be. We know that Ken Conrad is going to be the candidate for the United States Senate, although he shouldn't be, because he promised he wouldn't be unless he got the budget and trade deficits under control. And to my knowledge, as of this afternoon anyway, he hasn't. So he's just a little bit easier target, again, because he's in Congress, because in the Senate, and because he just has made a lot of mistakes. The other thing is that is an important race, not just because it's a big statewide election in North Dakota, but there's so much at stake when George Bush wants a majority. He saw how much Ronald Reagan was able to do when he had a majority in the United States Senate, and he wants that majority, and that's a big deal. There are large ramifications nationally as well as internationally. Obviously, the Persian Gulf War resolution, or the resolution authorizing the president to use force to take Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, was a clear example of what can happen if we don't have, Congress be squarely behind you. So anyway, that's part of why he tends to be a target of mine. But there's certainly nothing personal there for me.
Well, I on that note, if President Bush does want a Republican majority in the Senate, does that mean that President Bush could be persuaded to come to North Dakota for a campaign swing?
Well, they're always, they're always hesitant to make commitments, and certainly to make them early. In fact, I suspect that if and when the president comes here, we'll learn about it only days before it happens, maybe a week or two at the most. But I would, in talking with people in Washington and talking to people at the White House and at the Republican National Committee, I'd say there's a better than fair chance that the president will be here for this election cycle, and I would say that there's even a better chance that the vice president will. And I'm certain that the vice president's pending trip by the vice president would not be determined on a trip by the president. My guess is that we'll see both of them at least once in the state. But again, that's a commitment that we're not ready to make yet.
On the statewide offices, it's been said that a problem the Republican Party has is the inability to recruit young candidates who are willing to perhaps even lose a race and then try again. Now, you perhaps are making some strides in that direction, and yet I look at the two folks who have declared so far, and they're Mike Liffrig,
right,
whose father certainly had a little name recognition, but I'm not so sure that Mike does. And then Gary Tipton, who I don't think has name recognition. Mike is declared for Attorney General, and Gary's declared for Insurance Commissioner. Are things shaping up the way you want them to?
They're shaping up better than I thought they could with regard to that. And you referred to Mike and Gary, which I think is very significant. In 1988, we didn't have an Attorney General candidate until John Gosby declared about 2 days before the convention. We didn't have an insurance commissioner candidate at all until about halfway through the convention, when our candidate for one of the candidates for a Republican National Committee woman, who didn't win the seat, Margaret Bushy, decided then and was persuaded then to run for insurance commissioner. Right now, we have a candidate for each of those positions almost a year before the convention, so that's very encouraging. As you know, besides Mike being announced, there's been interest from others, including Senator Stenjum from Grand Forks, Duke Albrecht from here in Bismarck. And so when we look at it compared to 4 years ago, it looks very good. There are other people interested in insurance commissioner, at least two other very interested candidates who were at the roundup. And so, yeah, I mean, from a recruiting standpoint, things look better than ever for us. And I'm getting very actively involved in recruiting, and I'm just one of these people that believes that we cannot afford to come into 1992 and have an open slot. We just can't. We can't be spending all of our energies at the convention trying to recruit last-minute candidates.
Well, let me throw a caveat in
Sure.
here. You do have the people who are declared for insurance commissioner and for attorney general.
Right.
But both of the Democratic office holders have said they're not going to run again.
Right.
At least in the insurance commissioner's race, he's intimating he's not going to run again. And the attorney general said flat out he's not going to serve a third four-year term. So maybe, although you said you didn't have candidates last time, these are open seats perhaps.
Well, there's no question. First of all, an open seat, is much more desirable than one that's filled by a strong incumbent or any incumbent, for obvious reasons: name recognition, ability to raise money, all of those things. So the open seats do appeal, obviously, to candidates more, and that makes the recruiting process a lot easier. Although, with respect to this election cycle, I don't know how much of a difference that makes, because people are very hungry right now. Republicans are, and with Democrats having been in for 8 years now, and their record really not being any better than it was 4 years ago, really makes them a little more vulnerable because politics tends to be cyclical, as you know. And so 8-year cycles are fairly vulnerable anyway in state offices. You know.
Go back to something that you also said at the Republican Roundup. You talked about we can do 1980 all over again.
Right.
And, of course, 1980 was the year that Republicans swept just about everything
Yes,
in the state. And I think you had 2/3 control of both houses of the legislature at that time.
Yeah,
you
it
had
was
the,
very
quote,
strong.
veto-proof legislature.
Yeah.
What can you do to recreate 1980? Now, there are some people who would say that was just the popularity of Ronald Reagan swept all the Republicans into office in 1980. Are there some things that you can learn from 1980's campaign that you can probably apply to 1992?
Well, there are. Again, the cyclical situation, I think, can be applied here. So that there's just some, if you will, the things are lined up in our favor. The other thing is that we have a president, much like we had with Ronald Reagan, who was not a sitting president, but was immensely popular, as you know, in 1980. George Bush, in our latest poll about a month ago, had an 85% job performance approval rating in North Dakota. So we aren't naive enough to believe that it's going to necessarily be 85% in November of 1992. But at the same time, there's not much on the horizon for the Democrats to indicate that they're going to have a very strong candidate. And so that's the first step, is that we're going to have a very, very strong president, which really impacts the legislative races more than anything. Midterm elections tend to be kind of difficult for the president's party, but when the president's up for re-election, that tends to be traditionally a pretty good election anyway. And when we have one as popular as he is, it's even better yet. I mean, if he'd come out and campaign with us, obviously that'd make it that much better. So that's the first thing. The other thing, of course, is this cycle. The Democrats have been in for 8 years, and very frankly, there aren't very many people, including Democrats, who can point to a lot of successes in the last 8 years. The fact that we've lost population, there are fewer jobs than there were then, that size of government continues to grow out of control to the point now where the governor's talking about building a new building on the Capitol grounds. And I just... the mood is right, if you will, for us to capitalize on it if we can. And like I say, that doesn't just happen by accident. That takes a lot of hard work and inspiration and sweat and blood, sweat, and tears. But that's, I think it's very possible.
Now, there's a flip side to that, which one might call pessimism or perhaps pragmatism. It was a comment made by the state auditor, Bob Peterson, at the roundup 2 weekends ago in Beulah. He said, if all the Democrats stayed home, the Republicans and Independents would still re-elect Byron Dorgan, and that's pretty sad.
Yeah.
And I heard that comment and said, he's probably right.
Yeah.
What do you think of that observation?
Well, there's traditionally been some truth in that. Although this last election in 1990, Ed Schaefer was able to garner 35% of the vote, and the one thing I think that Ed was able to do, because he ran quite a what I would call a deep issues-oriented campaign, not a propaganda campaign, not a demagogue campaign, but rather quite in-depth on issues. As you will recall, the newspaper business did very well with him, because he ran some very large, in-depth newspaper articles, which a lot of advertising consultants might have thought wouldn't be effective. But what I think he did was he got the Republican faithful back into our column on the Dorgan race. And so I would say that Dorgan's honeymoon is over too. I really believe that, and that's that sounds like rhetoric, but I really think his honeymoon is over, and that we can start winning them over one at a time. After all, he's part of a bigger problem as well, being a member of Congress and having been there for 10 years, and people just are kind of displeased. But yeah, I'd say Bob's comment had some truth in it, although I'm not so sure that would be the case anymore.
Mm-hmm. That's also, I think Carter alluded to this earlier about the idea of recruiting young candidates. Mm-hmm. Can we all name the people who ran against Byron Dorgan? 1980, it was Smikowski.
That's true.
Was it 1982, Kent Jones?
That's correct.
1984,
Lois Altenberg.
Ivers Altenberg. 1986 was Seaver Vinci. Mm-hmm. 1988,
Steve Sidness.
And 1990 last year.
Was Ed Schaefer.
Was Ed Schaefer. There's always been this I guess it's unspoken, would you say, common wisdom, conventional wisdom about the Republican Party is that they eat their young. They give candidates one shot,
Right.
like a Steve Vinci gets one shot and then disappears from the scene.
Yeah.
Is that do you find that mood changing? You know, you mentioned Ed Schaefer got 35%.
Right.
He's being talked about as a potential candidate. Steve Sidness did 30% against Oregon, and he's talked about as a potential candidate now.
Well, that's very encouraging, and that's a very good point, which I've said all along. The one thing that I do believe about that U.S. House seat, if we are to be successful, what I think we need to do is to run a candidate 2, 3, if not even 4 times in a row. Somebody has to make that commitment to do it, or we have to make that commitment. And that's how I think we will eventually be successful in unseating Byron Dorgan. Newt Gingrich, the Republican whip in Congress, ran against the same incumbent 3 times before he got elected to the House of Representatives. But at the same time, I'm very pleased to see people like Steve Sidness and Ed Schaefer taking advantage, if you will, of the fact that they did get on a statewide ballot, and they did make a successful campaign, at least, of running against Byron Dorgan, and are now utilizing those resources and connections and name recognition to run for another office, whether it be against Dorgan or some other office. At least that is not being wasted, if you will. And they both are bright young stars. I think we've learned a lesson about that, because there's some truth, Dave, when you say that we've been guilty of eating our young. I think I'm evidence of that. I haven't exactly set the world on fire as a party operative, but at the same time, the experience that we've gained both through losing and winning, people have seen as valuable enough to put me into this position. I'm 30 years old. We have the youngest United States attorney in America, in Steve Easton, who was appointed by the president. We have the youngest state elected official in Craig Hagan at 25. I'm now 30 years old, the second youngest member of the Republican National Committee in the country, and hopefully all of that will, if we utilize it properly, we'll be able to inspire some young people. In 1988, 27% of the eligible voters voted for George Bush, 23% voted for Mike Dukakis, and 50% of the people, most of whom were 40 and younger, stayed home. And a New York Times poll on Election Day showed that if that other 50% would have voted, George Bush would have picked up another 4% or so. And so what we have is a younger generation which thinks Republican. They're basically strong defense, traditional family values. They tend to be very entrepreneurial-oriented, free enterprise oriented people who think Republican. And the problem is that they're either too busy or they're not inspired or whatever. For whatever reason, they don't vote, and certainly they don't get active in terms of contributing time and money to political activities. So hopefully, we can inspire some of that youth to run for office, to contribute, to get involved in campaigns, and then certainly to vote. And so I think our youth is, I think there's a real advantage to that right now.
Much has been made of your modeling yourself after, or your appreciation, your respect for Lee Atwater. Yeah. And the retort, at least I've seen in several letters to the editor, is, well, look at Lee. In his dying days, he essentially apologized for all that he had done, and in many respects repudiated the aggressive style he had done, the style that many people call dirty politics. What do you think about his final, I guess, change of position about how he operated?
Well, first of all, as you alluded to, I had great respect for Chairman Atwater, and I considered him to be a great tactician and strategist, and he clearly was that because he was successful. And I guess that's the bottom line, is that we help people get elected, and not to help them to run and come close, but to get in office, and he successfully did that. In his, as you said, in his dying days, he did apologize to some people, and probably appropriately so. The chairman was very tough. He did things that only he knew about in terms of the way campaign was run. For example, the Willie Horton ads. I don't know that. First of all, those weren't his ads. Those were run by a special interest group on supporting the president. But and he did apologize for some of that stuff. I don't. When I say that I emulate Lee Atwater, I do in the sense that I'm very aggressive. I'm very aggressive about pointing out the foibles of the other side. I think it's my responsibility. I think it's a responsibility I have to the party as well as to the public. But I do not condone stretching the truth or not telling the truth. I do not condone personal attacks, and that's not to say that I've never done them, because and when I have, I've not necessarily been pleased with myself. I try to attack judgment, policies, votes, but at the same time, when a person who's in office, when their integrity is such that it would appear that they're not telling the truth, or that they're not prepared to follow through on a commitment, then the attack does become somewhat personal, because it's their integrity that's the very issue that makes them not a suitable office holder. And so there is a balance and a fine line in that. But I have great respect for Lee Atwater. I felt I was sickened by our loss, because it was our loss when he died, and was, even when he was sick and was no longer to carry out the responsibilities at the Republican National Committee. I think we'd have another couple of governors if Lee Atwater had been well in the last campaign, because he was such a great tactician. But the bottom line with him was that he was successful, and Ronald Reagan and George Bush were president largely due to his efforts, and so I think a good track record is a good defense.
Now, during the last campaign, legislative campaign, specifically in 1990, there were a lot of people complaining about negative politicking and say this is the most negative, the dirtiest politicking we've ever seen in North Dakota. And North Dakotans just don't go for it, which, in light of what politicking is elsewhere around the country, you kind of have to laugh at the concept of negative campaigning.
Yeah, right.
But nevertheless, is that a concern of yours, that aggressive attack campaigning might backfire in North Dakota, which sometimes seems to be?
Sometimes. Yeah, I think that's, Carter, I think that sometimes that's the case, although for the most part, I also don't think that there would be too many Democrats in office if it wasn't effective. Kent Conrad's campaign against Mark Andrews was one of the most vicious, untruthful campaigns in the history of this region. The ads he ran about Mark, missing an important vote in the Senate to be speaking, to be vacationing in Florida, speaking to some swanky group. What he was doing is he was in Florida, speaking to a group of North Dakotans from Western States Life, which was, stationed in Fargo, and the vote he missed wasn't important at all, because he had already greased the skids for a better deal for the state, and there were comments, he distorted Mark's view on, or his record on, by pulling out specific votes with regard to senior citizens, and did that in a direct mail piece at the last minute to all senior citizens. And so, unfortunately, I don't think people do necessarily like negative campaigning, but at the same time, they seem to respond to it. I think Gene Hilken didn't think people would respond to negative campaigning either, but we weren't campaigning negatively. We were pointing out the fact that he voted for 16 tax increases since the last time he was elected, and that's just a bad record. And again, as long as we keep our attacks based on policies, votes, judgments, and not on personalities or especially at the legislative level, I think you have to be careful. Then I think you're okay. I think that's legitimate.
All right. And with that, we've come to the end of the half hour.
Oh, great.
Our guest today is Kevin Kramer, North Dakota Republican Party Executive Director and Chairman. Thank you, Kevin, for being here.
Thank you, Dave and Carter. It was my pleasure. Anytime.
And our guest questioner, Carter Wood, the political reporter for the Bismarck Tribune. Thanks, Carter. For the Prairie Weekly, I'm Dave Thompson.